Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard a story so disturbing that even after the lights were turned on, you still felt like something was standing behind you? Because tonight, I'm going to tell you one of those stories. Welcome to Mr. Night Storyteller, a place where true horror, unexplained mysteries, and chilling encounters hide in the dark. These are purely fictional stories. If this exists and really happened, it is just a coincidence. Just a story that was buried and forgotten, and I will tell it to you again as a bedtime story. So make sure your doors are locked, your phone is on silent, and the lights are turned low. Because once this story begins, there's no turning back. Let's get into it. The architecture of the Underworld. You do not come to Savannah to find the living, because you come here to negotiate with the dead. My name does not matter anymore, but for 12 years, I was the man in the charcoal vest and the silk top hat leading wide-eyed tourists through the fog-drenched corridors of the hostess city of the South. I was the keeper of the charming macabre. To the visitors from California or New York, Savannah is a postcard of Southern Gothic elegance, which is all cobblestones and weeping willows and iron gates. But to those of us who walk these squares at 3 o'clock in the morning, the city is something else entirely. It is a sprawling and beautiful necropolis where the veil between then and now is worn as thin as the lace of a widow. Savannah was built on its dead, and that is a literal fact and not just a ghost story told to entertain travelers. General James Oglethorpe designed this city in a series of perfect and haunting squares, and as the city grew, the cemeteries did not always move. They were simply paved over by the progress of man. You are always walking on the ribs of someone here. You are always breathing in the dust of the forgotten funeral of someone who died centuries ago. The very foundation of the city is composed of calcium and memory. I used to be a professional skeptic because you have to be in this line of work. If you truly believed every shadow was a specter, you would lose your mind before the first frost of November. I had my rehearsed speeches and my practiced jump scares and my cynical explanation for every cold spot. It is just a draft from the river, I would say, with a wink while pocketing a $20 tip. But then came that Tuesday in October. The air that night was different than the usual swampy heat. It was not just humid, but it was heavy, as if the atmosphere had been replaced with invisible and stagnant water. The scent of the city, which was usually a mix of salty river air and blooming jasmine, had turned sour. It carried the faint and metallic tang of wet earth and old copper. My tour group was small, which I usually liked, but tonight their silence was unnerving. There was a couple from Seattle who kept looking over their shoulders, and a tall man in a gray trench coat who stared at me with eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all. We moved through the streets like a funeral procession where the cobblestones felt slick as if they were sweating. Every street lamp we passed seemed to struggle against a darkness that was more than just the absence of light. It was a physical presence that crowded around us. We reached Wright Square around 11:45 at night. Wright Square is the psychological heart of the darkness of Savannah. It is a place of judicial trauma. Long before it was a park, it was the site of the gallows and the final resting place of Alice Riley. In 1735, Alice was the first woman executed in the Georgia colony. She was hanged for a murder she claimed she did not commit. They buried her right there in unhallowed ground, without a headstone and without a prayer. As I stood by the Tomochichi monument, holding my flickering brass lantern aloft, I began the tale. "Notice the trees, ladies and gentlemen," I whispered as my voice echoed off the surrounding courthouse walls. In every other square in this city, the Spanish moss hangs in thick and beautiful curtains. But here, in Wright Square, the moss refuses to grow. The birds refuse to nest. They say the soil is too bitter with the resentment of Alice to sustain any life that is not cursed. The couple from Seattle shivered in the damp air. But I was the one who felt the real chill. It started as a pressure, which was a physical weight pressing against the small of my back. It felt as if someone were standing inches behind me, leaning in to whisper a secret I did not want to hear. I felt the fine hairs on my arms stand up one by one. I turned around quickly while swinging the lantern to catch the intruder, but there was only the empty square and the tall man in the gray coat standing 10 feet away, as motionless as a statue. The silence of the square was absolute. Even the distant sounds of the city had vanished. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for the weight to lift, but it only grew heavier, as if the earth itself were trying to pull me down into the unhallowed dirt where Alice waited. The darkness seemed to thicken around the monument, and the flickering light of my lantern felt like a fragile barrier against a cold that was older than the city itself. The tall man in the gray coat continued to watch me without blinking. I realized then that I had stopped speaking my rehearsed lines. The tourists were waiting, but the words felt stuck in my throat like dry ash. I felt a sudden and overwhelming urge to apologize to the ground beneath my feet, but for what I did not know, the weight on my back shifted slightly, moving from my spine to my shoulders as if a heavy cloak had been draped over me. I tried to take a step forward, but my legs felt heavy like lead. Savannah was no longer a postcard or a tour stop. It was a mouth, and I was standing on its tongue. The negotiation had begun, and for the first time in 12 years, I realized I had nothing left to offer but myself. Part 2. The Hollow Echo. The Siphon of the Soul. The sensation that washed over me as I stood in the dead center of Wright Square was not pain, because pain is merely a biological signal or a warning from the body to the brain. This was something far more invasive and terrifying, as it was a direct violation of the soul itself. As the headless shadow had its spindly hand hovered over the chest of my own silhouette on the cold cobblestones, I felt a sudden and violent drain, like a siphon had been attached to the very core of my being. The humid and heavy Savannah heat vanished instantly and was replaced by a vacuum of absolute zero that seemed to freeze the blood in my veins. My knees buckled under the weight of an exhaustion that was not physical but spiritual. I wanted to collapse and surrender to the darkness that was pooling around my boots like spilled ink, but a primal instinct screamed in the back of my mind that if I fell here, I would become part of the soil forever. I would become nothing more than another story for another tour guide to recite to bored travelers. With a groan that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being, I forced my legs to move against the invisible tide. It felt like wading through waist-deep molasses as the gravity of the square tried to anchor me to the spot where Alice Riley had been discarded. I kicked backward with all my remaining strength, and my boot scuffed through the invisible grip of the entity. There was a sound that I will never forget, which was a wet and tearing noise like Velcro being ripped apart slowly as my shadow was forcibly detached from the thing on the ground. The connection broke and the soul-crushing cold retreated, but it only left me slightly warmer. I did not wait to see if the headless shape would pursue me through the mist. I scrambled to my feet with my breath coming in ragged and white plumes of vapor, and I began to sprint as if the devil himself were at my heels. The labyrinth of the night. I ran out of Wright Square with my boots hammering against the damp pavement in a frantic rhythm. I did not look at the weeping willow trees, and I did not look back at the Tomochichi Monument, because I knew the sight would break my sanity. I kept my eyes fixed on the distant and flickering neon sign of a parking garage 3 blocks away, but Savannah is a labyrinth designed to confuse the lost. The familiar streets felt warped and elongated, as if the city itself were stretching to keep me within its boundaries. The brick buildings seemed to lean inward, with their windows looking like dead eyes watching a rat run through a maze of iron and stone. Then the sound returned. Slap, slap, slap. It was louder now, and it was no longer just the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of heavy and wet meat hitting the ground with an impossible and sickening force. The thing was fast, and it was closing the distance with every stride. I reached the heavy oak door of my apartment building on Broughton Street while wheezing for air that felt like broken glass in my lungs. My fingers were numb and useless as I fumbled with my keychain in the dark. The metal keys jingled with a cheerful sound that felt mockingly out of place in the face of such horror. Slap, slap. The pressure wave of its movement was pushing against my back, and the smell of stagnant pond water and old copper was overwhelming. I jammed the key into the lock and twisted it with a force that nearly snapped the metal before throwing myself inside and slamming the heavy door shut and throwing the deadbolt. The independent shadow. I collapsed against the wood of the door and slid down to the floor with my chest heaving. Silence returned to the lobby, and for a long time, there was only the sound of the refrigerator humming and the blood rushing in my ears like a distant storm. I waited for a banging on the door or a scream from the street, but there was nothing but the heavy and oppressive quiet of the building. I whispered to myself that I was safe, but the word tasted like rust and lies in my mouth. I dragged myself up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, which was labeled 3B. Every shadow on the stairwell looked like a threat, and a simple coat rack looked like a grasping hand reaching out to claim me. I burst into my apartment and locked that door too before immediately turning on every single light in the place. I needed photons to survive, and I needed to banish every corner of darkness from the kitchen to the small closet. I went to the kitchen sink and splashed cold water on my face to try and ground myself in reality. I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink, and I looked gray and aged. My eyes were wide, and the pupils were dilated so much they were almost black, as if I were a man who had seen his own grave and was still standing in it. I reached for a bottle of bourbon on the counter with hands that were trembling so violently the glass clinked against my teeth as I took a long pull of the amber liquid. Tap. I froze in place with the bottle hovered halfway to my mouth. The sound had not come from the hallway or the street, but from the living room behind me. The air in the apartment, which had been stale and warm a moment ago, began to cool rapidly until the condensation on the glass froze into intricate patterns of frost. Tap, tap. It was the sound of a fingernail on the hardwood floor, and it was rhythmic and patient. I turned around slowly and saw the living room bathed in the harsh light of the ceiling fixture, but there was no monster standing there. The sofa was empty and the television was off, but then I looked at the floor. The overhead light was casting my shadow onto the hardwood, but the shadow was not mimicking my movements. I was standing still and clutching a bottle, but my shadow was crouching on all fours. Its hands were pressed against the floor, and its head was gone. The shadow began to crawl across the floor, independent of my physical body, moving like a spider that was elongated and jerky as it headed toward the corner of the room where the darkness was thickest. The call of the headless. My mind could not process the sight because shadows are supposed to be physics, and the absence of light blocked by an object. They are not supposed to have agency or hunger. I screamed at the wall, asking what it wanted and telling it that I had left the square. The shadow stopped and slowly rose up the wall until it became a two-dimensional stain on the white paint. Then a sound filled the room that did not come from the shadow, but from everywhere at once. It was a low and guttural vibration that rattled the window panes and sounded like a voice trying to speak through a throat filled with thick mud. It whispered the word vessel, and I stumbled back while knocking a chair over in my panic. The entity was not just haunting a location anymore, because by touching my shadow in the square, it had hitched a ride and tethered itself to me. I ran to the window thinking about the fire escape, but as I looked out at the street below, I saw a sight that froze my soul. Down on Broughton Street, under the streetlights, people were walking their dogs or holding hands with their partners in normal late-night scenes. But as they passed under the lamps, I saw that their shadows were not following them. Their shadows were all stopping and turning to look up at my window on the third floor. Dozens of dark and headless shapes on the pavement were all fixated on apartment 3B. The entity was pulling the darkness from the entire city toward me, and I realized with a sick and sinking feeling that the locks on the doors were useless. You cannot lock out a shadow, and you cannot barricade yourself against the absence of light. Then the lights in my apartment began to flicker once and then twice as the darkness rushed in from the edges of the room like a tidal wave. The bulb in the kitchen popped with a loud crack and rained glass onto the floor, and then the hallway light died. Only the small lamp by the sofa remained, and in that shrinking circle of light, I saw the creature manifest physically. It rose from the floorboards as a mass of charred ropes of muscle woven together and wet with the fluid of the grave. It had no face, but the vertical slit in its chest opened to reveal a swirling vortex of absolute blackness. It raised a hand with too many fingers that were all broken and bent at wrong angles, and it pointed at the last source of light. I scrambled backward, and my hand closed around a box of matches on the side table. As the creature lunged and the lamp flickered out for the final time, I did not scream, but I struck a match. Part 3. The Eternal Silence. The Altar of Flame. The flame was a pathetic and tiny trembling teardrop of orange fire held against a tsunami of ancient darkness. But when the light flared, the thing in front of me shrieked with a sound that was not made by lungs or vocal cords. It was the sound of tectonic plates grinding together, which was a vibration so intense it cracked the glass of the window panes and made my teeth ache with the pressure of the noise. The creature recoiled as its form rippled like oil on the surface of water, and the vertical slit in its chest snapped shut, which cut off the deafening whisper of the void. For a split second, I saw the monster clearly in the flickering matchlight, and I realized it was not just a shadow, but a patchwork of misery, and a collage of every fear ever felt in that cursed square stitched together into a humanoid shape. that was now terrified of the light. The match burned down to my fingertips, and I hissed in pain, but I did not drop it as I looked at the bottle of bourbon in my other hand, which was 100 proof and highly flammable. I roared at the creature, asking if it wanted a vessel, before I hurled the contents of the bottle directly at the writhing darkness. The amber liquid splashed against the creature and soaked into its impossible skin, and before the match could go out, I flicked the fire forward. The room did not just catch fire, but it exploded as the alcohol ignited instantly and turned the creature into a pillar of blue and orange flame. The fire did not burn it like flesh, but instead seemed to burn the shadow itself as the entity thrashed wildly with its limbs elongating and snapping against the walls and the ceiling. The wallpaper curled and blackened while the curtains caught fire and the heat became instantaneous and blistering. I scrambled backward while shielding my face with my arm as the smoke became thick and oily with the smell of burning ozone and rotten meat. I crawled toward the bedroom window because the creature was blocking the front door in a flailing storm of fire and shadow. The world of bulbs. I grabbed a heavy wooden chair and smashed the remaining glass of the bedroom window to let the fresh oxygen rush in, which fed the fire and turned my apartment into a blast furnace. I climbed out onto the rusted metal grate of the fire escape and gasped for the cool night air while looking down at the street below. The shadow people and the headless reinforcements I had seen earlier were gone because the light of the fire pouring from my window had banished them back into the cracks of the city. I did not stop to watch my life burn, but climbed down the rattling metal stairs and jumped the last 10 feet to the alleyway below. My ankle twisted with a sickening crunch, but I did not feel the pain because the adrenaline was a powerful drug that kept me moving. I limped out of the alley and merged into the crowd of people who were already gathering on Broughton Street to watch the flames licking the night sky. The official report called it an electrical fire caused by faulty wiring in an old building, and the authorities said it was a tragedy, but lucky that the tenant was not home at the time. I did not stick around to correct their assumptions because I left Savannah that very night by taking a bus to Atlanta and then a plane to Seattle. I finally drove as far north as the roads would take me until I settled in a small town in Alaska where the sun does not set for months during the summer. I live in a basement apartment now, which is ironic, but this space is rigged with 24 industrial-grade floodlights mounted on the ceiling. I have battery backups and diesel generators and enough candles to burn down a church because there is no corner of this room that is not bathed in blinding and clinical white light. I do not have shadows here because I have surgically removed them with lumens, and for 3 years I thought I had won the negotiation. The transfer of the weight. I am recording this message for you now because the generator is failing and the low hum in the background is the sound of the main power grid dying in the middle of a storm. The backup generator has been sputtering for the last hour, and I have maybe 10 minutes of light left before the darkness returns. I realized too late that the thing in Right Square did not just want to possess me, but it wanted to brand me as its own. Last week, I cut my finger while cooking, and the blood that dripped onto the white floor was not red, but was a deep and oily black. It did not pool on the tiles, but evaporated into a mist that smelled of Spanish moss and old grapes. It has been inside me since that night in Savannah, and it was just waiting for me to feel safe and for the lights to go out. The lights in the corner of the room just died, and now there are only 18 lights left to protect me from the void. I can hear the entity now, but it is not the footsteps or the slapping sound because I hear it inside my own head like the rustling of dry leaves. It is whispering the name of Alice over and over as 15 lights remain. I am telling you this story not to warn you, but to apologize, because a curse like this is like energy that cannot be destroyed and can only be transferred. By listening to this, and by imagining the square and the moss and the hanging tree, you have opened a door in your own mind. You have acknowledged the thing that follows, and acknowledgement is all it needs to find a new scent to follow. There are only 10 lights left, and it is getting dark in here as my shadow is starting to form on the wall, despite my best efforts. The shadow on the wall does not have a head, and it is raising a finger to its lips to tell me to be quiet as 5 lights remain. I am going to turn off the recorder now and close my eyes, and if I'm lucky, it will be quick, but if I am not, then I will be back in Right Square waiting for you to visit. Only 1 light remains, and whatever you do, you must not look at your shadow right now, and you must not look behind you. If you hear a click or a tap sound in your room tonight, then you must run as fast as your legs will carry you.